I'm Laura Ketzel, and I'm your host for Forrester's podcast, What It Means, where we explore the latest market dynamics impacting executives and their customers. Today, I am joined by two of my fantastic colleagues, Vice President and Research Director Pascal Matzka and Principal Analyst Bernhard Schaffrig, to discuss how leaders can unlock more creativity in their organizations. So welcome, Pascal, and welcome, Bernhard.
Pleasure to be here.
Thanks for having me.
So when I first saw this piece of research on creativity being the hidden key to innovation, my first thought was, is creativity really a hidden key? Like, how can we have innovation without creativity? So, Bernhard, can you tell me a little bit about why it's hidden?
With absolute pleasure. Innovation, if we take the very basic or a pure definition of it, is nothing but doing things differently than before. And that's more about executing on ideas people might have, execution excellence, about change, managing the change, and getting things truly done differently than before, better than before, more effective, more efficient, if you will. And in many ways, innovation doesn't necessarily require creativity. But when it comes to these famous, ingenious, unconventional solutions nobody has ever thought of, then creativity is the answer, or one out of maybe two or three answers. So I'd say that creativity is a great driver of innovation, is a precursor to innovation, but it's not that one essential ingredient you need for any innovation to come true.
But I think also one of the reasons why it is a hidden ingredient, and it is often hidden by purpose, is because creativity is also, as Bernhard indicated, doing something out of the norm. And in particular, in economically tough times, companies don't want to do things out of the norm. They want to have people working in line with the norms. And I think therein lies a little bit of the, what should I say, the roadblock to driving creativity explicitly to really foster innovation, not just for the one project, but really as part of a corporate culture. Whilst some of these cultural connotations, I think, differ depending on industry and the type of organization that you work with. But I think the reason why we're asking the question the way we are raising it today is because for many business decision makers, creativity is not necessarily a positive thing.
If I may add one sentence to that, and especially to your last comment, Pascal, which I fully agree to, Albert Einstein once said that creativity is intelligence having fun. And intelligence is something these leaders might accept, but fun in the workplace, that tries to rob them of control. And this is what many, especially in the times we are in, might not appreciate.
Got it. Okay. So I'm hoping that you're wrong about the discouraging all fun in the workplace. That sounds relatively dismal. But Pascal, I was interested in what you said about, especially in difficult times, leaders don't necessarily want people working out of the norm, which was what you were talking about as one important aspect of creativity. So is that because of the sort of natural risk aversion that people develop in difficult times? To what do you attribute that?
It's partly that, but I think there is a broader issue here in the sense that any organization, is organized along the lines of clearly defined functions and processes that are operating with the purpose of driving efficiencies and effectiveness. Creativity is not a measure that we work towards to. It is a tool. It is an enabler for changing things, doing things differently, and innovate. But the way we are measuring people, the way we are training people, the way we are, and I'm overgeneralizing here, I realize this, but broadly speaking, in the context of corporate governance and corporate cultures, creativity is not a design point. It often happens by accident. It is often not wanted. It is not that it's not allowed, but it's not explicitly sort of mentored or pushed forward. And I think, again, this is where, in particular in economically difficult times, organizations like to execute and focus on the bottom line, the efficiency, the cost takeout. And they always feel that people being creative, they're wasting their time, they're wasting money. And again, I'm overgeneralizing here, but there is this sentiment with many business leaders that creativity is not helping in the context of economically difficult times.
Got it. So, Bernard, I was really struck by one of the sentences in your piece of research here, and I'll play it back for you, and because I'd like for you to talk to everybody about what the implications are. So, you say innovation without creativity is impossible. Creativity without an innovation process will never become tangible, which seems like a really profound piece of insight. So, tell us more.
And actually, it is not more than profound, but the implications are so huge, right? And maybe to build on what Pascal just said, so actually leaders should turn things around. So in tight, tough times, they should make creativity first priority and not just delivering on the efficiencies and the bottom lines and ideally on the top lines as well. Because there are so many people out there who want to go the extra mile. And having all these great creative ideas is one thing, but it will completely disappear, that creative energy, not only the creative ideas, if these are not channeled through what we are calling an innovation process. Now, this sounds really procedural and like governance, but many well-oiled innovation processes we are able to observe from our clients, they are not perceived as those that are very rigid and highly governed and very strict, but actually help these creative ideators to turn ideas into something tangible. And maybe at a certain proof point, they will learn that actually it was a good idea, but at this point in time, we cannot implement that for various reasons. But actually, one requires the other if you want to turn these creative ideas into something tangible for the company that sticks. Some organizations actually are able to do without these innovation processes, but then they're usually very small in size. If I may add one thing on fun, because I guess all three of us at least once mentioned fun. And it's interesting because in psychological research, many scientists try to identify and find out the root causes when people are getting in a creative mode, when they are creative, and then they might have fun, and they use fun as an analogy to childlike play. Now, on the other hand, in the economic context or the context of work and professional work, the question is, would you want such environments? And what these researchers concluded on anonymously is that by leaders creating work environments that at times enable playful, childlike, even non-purposeful, and therefore fun-generating moods, these are prerequisites for people being creative and being ingenious. So it's quite interesting that there is this relationship from childhood, from early childhood, where non-purposeful activities and thinking leads to something very tangible if we let people think and work along these lines. I found that quite interesting.
So let's take as read that businesses want innovation when they want to grow and they want to take big steps forward. And that this podcast, hopefully, along with some of the research we've written, will go some ways to convincing them that means they need creativity also. So let's talk some about the practical, because we've talked a bit about the process that you need to turn creativity into something tangible, as it were. What are some of the ways that organizations discourage creativity without meaning to? Because one of the things I learned from listening to you about this at our recent event was that sometimes this is entirely unintentional. So what do companies do without realizing it?
Of course, there are a couple of examples of where businesses maybe unintentionally discourage creativity. And one builds on on what Pascal said at the beginning. So especially companies that are very successful at what they are and the way they are, they usually become excellent at process execution, and everything is geared towards excellent execution. And that, of course, shapes the culture of that company. So being great at execution usually prevents or inhibits a whole bunch of creative types of work. It's not a given, but this is something we see and hear very often, because creativity doesn't have a specific spot. It falls underneath the normal operational ways of getting work done. And that's also something we specifically find in very large enterprises, where execution is kind of the master principle. People in these companies have unlearned to dedicate time to thinking about a problem and unleashing their own creativity. Everything has to have an owner, and especially something that requires time, because time equals money. It requires responsibility or accountability by a person. Now, you usually cannot find such responsibilities and accountabilities for creativity in such brilliantly executing companies, which is why it's hard for people to establish that without even knowing that. So it's more on an individual level that we see creativity being completely ignored or neglected or abandoned, if it used to be there, seen as something that's just stealing time. Now, of course, that there are many other reasons for why creativity is discouraged, and that, of course, neglecting people's resource needs when it comes to being creative. And I guess we will talk about that later. Not having this right working environment, which helps them to get into that playful, non-purposeful state of mind that allows them to being creative, because this is something that has to be explicitly nurtured.
Yeah, and I think just to add to this, there is the fear factor, right? In many of these sort of very stringently operating organizations, people fear to be creative because they might get punished. This happens in particular in highly regulated industries. Now, I'm not arguing that you should be creative whilst you're, for instance, doing the aircraft maintenance, because if aircraft maintenance goes wrong and you're trying to be creative there, that is not a good thing. But the point being that within the context of the operational procedures that you drive to basically drive growth and productivity, you always need to find this time window, this sort of boxed environment that allows you to really for people to drive the creativity that they have. So everything has its place, everything has its time and moment. But what is really preventing organizations from even getting to that point is oftentimes the fear factor, where people just feel that not only are they not getting rewarded for being creative, but they fear that they're getting punished for doing so.
Got it. So let's talk a little bit about the environment that's conducive to this that Bernhard mentioned briefly before. So if I'm an executive looking to create an environment where not only do people not feel punished or penalized for being creative, but where it's actually encouraged, what are the ingredients for that?
Yeah, I can start. So in my research on that topic, I came up with 7 behaviors leaders should take, must consider to not only boost creativity, but also create that work environment that allows people to become creative. And it I guess none of these are surprising. So starting with things like rewarding collaboration, not necessarily over individual performance, but rewarding people's collaboration is a thing that allows people to be more creative, because as it's incentivized to collaborate, people are bouncing back and forth ideas as they are humans. So it's happening naturally that creativity is becoming part of the way they interact. And by rewarding collaboration, no matter if it's a great performance or just the fact that people collaborated to get stuff done, that's already one behavior that is helping tremendously. And along these lines, taking risks as a team is also something that shouldn't get punished. And of course, every leader out there is talking about the need to change culture towards being more risk tolerant or open to risk taking. But whenever an individual is taking a risk, then usually the first thing that happens is that this individual is getting punished. And this is something that kills creativity, of course, out of fear, as Pascal said. Sharing information is another thing. There are still too many people out there who hold back information because they want to use it as a power play or to manifest their own position in an organization. And that's bad. It's company IP. Sharing information creates a very transparent culture that helps people being creative. Managerial attitudes like helping people to speak up in a specific environment that fits them is also something that nurtures creativity. Downplaying power differences, hierarchical differences, downplaying status symbols, the classic ones, from business cards to company cards. That's something that doesn't belong to a creative working setup, but it's happening very often. And these power differences lead not only to fears, but also to people not daring to speak up. And then there are two more. One is, as a manager, as a leader, you should walk your own talk, which means that you cannot know everything. So asking other people, your direct reports, your peers, your own supervisors for help, and taking the help you're getting seriously is a great role model. And if you talk about you asking others for help, this is changing the game as well, because again, it favors collaboration, which is a key ingredient for people being open and not stressed to be creative and come up with unconventional ideas. And then, of course, listening to others without prejudices, not judging on people's ideas in the first place. And again, this is a very, very practical tip, but it's happening all too often, and that kills creativity.
And these management traits become particularly important if you work in a highly diverse and multi-generational environment, in particular with the younger generation, the generation Z or Z, where you have, folks that are also often frustrated by hierarchical structures, by management exposing status symbols. I think this is really an important element to realize here, that not only do you need to have those management traits, but you need to in particular also cater for the different ways of communicating, collaborating, and co-innovating across the different generations, the different cultural elements within the organization, to really make it work. And that is all part of this sort of innovation, creativity culture that you need.
So, Bernhard, I've certainly seen some of your work on Generation Z specifically. And so I'm curious, because everyone loves to think about how are different generations different and what do each of them bring to the table. So what does our newest generation to join the workforce bring to us that we should look for?
A lot of things. So I try to only talk about these that are specific, as per our research, to Gen Z, and not specific to them being young ages. So one thing for sure is they are globally connected, and of course through all their devices and the internet is the key prerequisite for that. So they also feel very connected virtually, but at times they feel somewhat isolated, and that's due to the fact that it's impossible to translate cognitively, mentally, that digital connectedness into real life experiences, and that's creating not only a dichotomy, but also some type of paradox, which some of them suffer heavily from, also in the workplace. So this is something leaders must consider. At the same time, they are very globally connected. They are also very hacky and do-it-yourselfish. So whenever they have a question, of course, related to something intangible, something digital, they access their communities online and ask for help, and they have their social platforms. So they get things done, which makes them very efficient, which is another trait or characteristic. differently from previous generations, but at the same time, they might feel a little bit isolated. Also, the majority of Gen Z individuals value themselves as being very diverse and also very inclusive individuals compared to previous generations. Now, they said that, it's not us saying that. And of course, both COVID and the climate crisis tremendously shaped their worldview and also their view on typical classic careers in organizations, the way they view job versus life, and the famous work-life balance is something that matters to them differently than previous generations.
Got it. So one of the things you mentioned about Gen Z, of course, is that they're they're digital native. So let's talk about the role of technology in creativity, because you get sort of opposing viewpoints of technology and creativity. On the one hand, there's some traditional ideas about technology that's created to make efficient process silos that's stifling of creativity. And on the other hand, you have the position of technology at your fingertips being an enabler to creativity. So, Bernhard, what do you think?
Um, so technology can be both an enabler for creativity. It is definitely an enabler of innovation, but you could also turn it around and use technology as the creative aspect, which again drives innovation and drives people to become even more creative. And think about specifically AI, or now Gen AI. A couple of days ago, I was in a session where people were supposed to ideate around something that was really complex, and they had never worked with each other. So I thought, why don't they turn on ChatGPT and ask ChatGPT for a couple ideas? And it was just a great icebreaker. And people, as many have this famous horror vacui, so starting from that blank sheet of paper, that horrifies many people. But as ChatGPT spit out a couple very stupid ideas, it not only generated a great laugh, but they could build ideas off of these ideas coming from a technology. At the same time, many creative ideas are simply impossible without technology. Think about improving operational processes, production processes without edge devices, IoT platforms, cloud computing. You could never even think about predictive maintenance to make maintenance much less painful, much less costly. So I guess both ends of innovation processes benefit from technology.
If you understand that technology is an enabling function, technology in and of itself is not the purpose of innovation, at least not in most instances, unless you are working for a high-tech innovation company. But I think what I realize, and this goes back to the ChatGPT or Gen AI argument, where I see frustration now growing with many innovation teams is that their task is give me a Gen AI innovation. So most people don't understand what Gen AI really entails. So again, I think using creativity or using the technology creatively means it has to be playful. It shouldn't be forced. It should be clear what the limitations of the technology are. But then also that means that companies or people can build trust in using the technology in the right way. So again, I think what we need to understand here is that the technology is a great enabler, it's a great tool, but it's rarely the purpose of the innovation. The outcome, ultimately, that we create through the technology-driven innovation is something else.
So let's think about the folks, hopefully the many people who are listening to our excellent podcast here. And so if you were going to give them one suggestion for a way to unlock a little more creativity in their working life and thus unlock a little more innovation, hoping that they have the processes for turning creativity into innovation, as it were, what piece of advice might you give them?
The one thing to me is time. Give people time to understand the challenge, to understand the problem. And time doesn't mean now you have 10 minutes of time to think about the problem. but actually all the time they need. Now, this might sound stupid because in our busy lives, there is no place for that, but there are companies out there who manage to give people time, and maybe not at times where tight project timelines have to be kept, but there should be other times. And if there are no other times, then something's going wrong anyway in such an organization. So some companies I'm working with, they give people half an hour per week, twice a week, per month, whatever works. And people are having the freedom to block this time off. And then it's preferred thinking time, thinking about the challenge, thinking about the problem, truly understanding it. And only then another time element is to think about a potential solution, which is where creativity is an essential part. But I guess time, both for truly understanding the issue, the problem, the challenge, and time to think about creative solutions, maybe even in collaboration with others.
Got it. And Pascal, what about you? What piece of advice would you give our listeners about if they want to make a little more metaphorical space for creativity and the resultant innovation in the lives of their colleagues and the teams that they lead?
To me, one of the biggest stumbling blocks to creativity and also to innovation more generally speaking are the inherent silo structures and the operational procedures that, as I said earlier, we have perfected so much over recent years. And I think we need to understand that innovation and creativity not only require time and context, but they also require an organizational model that not just focuses on the linear practices of our businesses, but that connect between the different practices so that we can drive the outside-in perspective, so that we can drive the co-innovation, and so that we can also elevate the skill structures towards more multidisciplinary skills, more diverse skill sets. So for me, it really boils down to this issue of tearing down the silo structures and driving skill sets and also operational elements that shift us from this sort of command and control modus operandi to a much more clustered skill set and operational model that we want to scale.
Got it. Well, thank you very much both for the pieces of advice and also for opening everyone's eyes a little more to what they can do to encourage creativity and resultant innovation in their professional lives and in their organizations. So thank you very much, Bernhard, and thank you, Pascal.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
If you like what you heard today, subscribe to Forrester's What It Means podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. To continue the conversation, follow Forrester on LinkedIn or drop us a note at podcast@forrester.com. Thanks for listening.